That morning had started like any other Thursday in September. I was rushing around my apartment, trying to gather my things for my morning classes at Cascade Community College. The familiar smell of coffee filled the small kitchen as I stuffed notebooks into my backpack, already running late. That's when my mother showed up unannounced, as she often did since Dad passed away last year. "Mira," she called through the screen door. "Let me in, sweetheart. I brought you something." Mom always looked out of place in my somewhat shabby apartment complex, with her carefully coordinated outfits and perfectly maintained hair. Today she wore one of her real estate agent suits, navy blue with gold buttons, and carried a small paper bag from the hardware store. "I can't stay long, Mom," I said, letting her in. "I've got Professor Martinez's class in 30 minutes, and you know how he is about tardiness." She waved away my protests, setting her oversized purse on my kitchen counter. "This will just take a minute." From the paper bag, she pulled out a small black flashlight. It looked expensive, the kind with multiple settings and an emergency strobe feature. "I want you to carry this." I tried not to roll my eyes. Ever since the incident in the college parking lot last month, just some drunk guy asking for directions, nothing serious, she'd been increasingly worried about my night classes. "Mom, campus security." I know, she cut me off, pressing the flashlight into my hand. "Campus security does regular patrols. The parking lot is well lit. You've told me. But humor your mother, please?" Her voice caught slightly on the last word, and I saw that familiar look of worry in her eyes, the same one she'd worn through Dad's final months. The flashlight was surprisingly heavy for its size, solidly built with a textured grip. "It's got a strobe setting," Mom explained, demonstrating how to activate it. "Shine it in someone's face if they're creeping around. It'll disorient them long enough for you to get away." I almost laughed at how serious she was about it, but something in her expression stopped me. Instead, I slipped the flashlight into my jacket pocket and gave her a quick hug. "Thanks, Mom. I'll keep it with me." She smiled, relief evident on her face. "That's all I ask. Oh, and don't forget dinner on Sunday. I'm making lasagna." As I watched her drive away in her immaculately maintained Volvo, I had no idea that small flashlight would become so important just 12 hours later. The day passed in a blur of lectures and study sessions. I'd been taking extra classes this semester, trying to finish my prerequisites for nursing school. Between work at the coffee shop and my full course load, I barely had time to breathe, let alone worry about personal safety. The flashlight sat forgotten in my jacket pocket until evening, when I got a text from my friend Chris. "Still up for our Thursday trail run? Luna needs her exercise and I need to vent about work." I almost said no. I had a paper due Monday for my anatomy class and the weather forecast wasn't great, but Chris had been my best friend since high school, and our weekly hikes were sometimes the only thing that kept me sane during particularly stressful weeks. Plus, Luna, his miniature schnauzer, was basically my part-time therapy dog. "Meet you at the Oak Ridge lot at 6?" I texted back. "Perfect. Luna says you better bring treats." I smiled, picturing his dog's expectant face. Luna was the most spoiled schnauzer in the Pacific Northwest, and I was partially to blame. As I gathered my hiking clothes, I transferred the flashlight from my jacket to my small day pack, another decision that would prove more significant than I could have imagined. Oak Ridge State Park sprawled across nearly 5,000 acres of old-growth forest, but most visitors stuck to the main loop trail, a well-maintained 5-mile path that wound through towering Douglas firs and western red cedars. Chris and I had been hiking this trail every Thursday for the past 2 years, watching it change through the seasons. We'd seen it draped in spring wildflowers, baking under summer sun, and buried under winter snow. But something about the trail felt different that evening. The parking lot was unusually empty when I pulled in at 6:05 p.m. Normally, there'd be at least a dozen cars hardcore trail runners getting in their evening exercise, families finishing up their afternoon walks, amateur photographers catching the golden hour light. Today, there were only 3 vehicles: my beat-up Honda Civic, Chris's Subaru Outback, and a dark sedan I didn't recognize, parked in the furthest corner of the lot. Chris was waiting by the trailhead, Luna dancing around his feet in excitement. He looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from too many hours staring at computer screens and dealing with office politics. At 32, he was a few years older than me, but lately the startup life had been aging him faster than normal. "You look like hell," I said by way of greeting, crouching down to give Luna her expected belly rubs. "Thanks for the confidence boost," he replied, managing a weak smile. "You try dealing with Silicon Valley types who think sleep is for the weak." He ran a hand through his perpetually messy brown hair. "The new manager, Derek? He's been scheduling meetings at 6 a.m. to sync with the California office." Luna interrupted his complaint by shoving her nose into my backpack, clearly searching for the treats she knew I'd brought. I pulled out a couple of her favorite bacon-flavored biscuits, watching her precise, ladylike way of taking them from my hand. For a dog that looked like a scrappy dust mop, she had surprisingly refined manners. "Ready?" Chris asked, checking his Apple Watch. "Sun's setting earlier these days. We should probably do the shorter loop." I nodded, falling into step beside him as we started up the trail. The first half-mile was a gentle incline, the path wide and well-marked. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy high above, creating shifting patterns on the ground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves, that particular autumn smell that always reminded me of new notebooks and fresh starts. "So, tell me about this manager from hell," I prompted as we walked. Chris needed to vent, and I needed a distraction from thinking about my upcoming anatomy exam. He launched into a detailed description of the latest workplace drama, something about unrealistic deadlines and competing visions for their project. I half listened, noting how the forest was changing around us as we climbed higher. The friendly, park-like atmosphere of the lower trail was giving way to something older, more primeval. The trees here were ancient giants, their trunks wider than cars, their lowest branches starting 50 feet up. "And then he had the nerve to suggest we work through the weekend," Chris was saying as we reached Cedar Point, a natural overlook about 2 miles in. Like we're all single 20-somethings with nothing better to do than debug his pet features. We paused at the viewpoint, catching our breath. The valley spread out below us, the town's lights just starting to twinkle on in the gathering dusk. A cool breeze carried the promise of rain, and heavy clouds were building on the western horizon earlier than the forecast had predicted. Luna, who had been happily exploring the trail edges, suddenly stopped and stared into the deeper forest. Her ears pricked forward, and a low whine escaped her throat. "What is it, girl?" Chris asked, instantly alert. Luna wasn't prone to nervousness. We'd encountered deer, raccoons, and even a black bear on these trails, and she'd always remained calm. We stood quietly, listening. The normal evening sounds of the forest bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant hammering of woodpeckers had gone silent. It was the kind of stillness that typically preceded a storm, but something about it felt wrong. "We should probably head back," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "It's getting dark faster than I thought." Chris checked his watch again. "Yeah, you're right. We've got maybe 40 minutes of usable light left." We turned back toward the trailhead, picking up our pace slightly. The clouds were moving in faster now, thick gray masses that further dimmed the fading daylight. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I zipped up my fleece jacket, grateful for its warmth. That's when Luna froze again, this time staring intently down the trail ahead of us. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound I'd never heard her make before. And there, in the gathering gloom about 100 yards ahead, we saw the figure. The figure ahead moved with an unnatural slowness, like someone trying very hard to appear casual. In the dimming light, details were difficult to make out, but several things immediately struck me as wrong. His clothing, for one, instead of hiking gear or athletic wear, He wore what appeared to be business casual attire: dark slacks, a light-colored button-down shirt, leather shoes that were completely inappropriate for trail conditions. "That's odd," Chris muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Luna's growl had subsided to a constant low rumble, her body rigid with tension. I reached into my backpack and found the flashlight my mother had given me that morning. It felt reassuringly solid in my hand, heavier than it looked. The beam, when I switched it on, was surprisingly powerful, cutting through the growing darkness like a laser. The man was about 50 yards ahead now, and with the flashlight's illumination, I could see him more clearly. He was broad-shouldered and tall, probably around 6 feet, with gray hair cut in an expensive-looking style. Everything about him seemed carefully maintained: his posture, his clothing, his measured pace. He could have stepped out of a corporate boardroom, which made his presence here at this hour all the more disturbing. Most striking was his complete lack of equipment. No flashlight, no water bottle, no backpack. Nothing that anyone with even basic hiking experience would carry, especially this late in the day. He seemed utterly unconcerned about the approaching darkness or the weather, maintaining that same deliberate pace. "Maybe we should wait here for a bit," Chris suggested. "Let him get further ahead." But before we could decide, my finger slipped on the flashlight switch, plunging us into sudden darkness. It was only for a few seconds, but when I managed to turn it back on, everything had changed. The man had stopped walking. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the trail, his back still to us. Then, with a movement that seemed too quick, too fluid to be natural, he stepped to the side of the path. As he moved, he raised something to his ear, a phone, presumably, but his posture was wrong for someone making a call. His head was tilted at an odd angle, his free arm hanging too stiffly at his side. "Good evening," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. It was cultured, pleasant even, but had an underlying quality that set my teeth on edge. "Beautiful night for a walk, isn't it?" Luna's growl intensified, and Chris grabbed her collar to keep her from lunging forward. I kept the flashlight beam trained on the man, noticing how he seemed to lean slightly away from the light, though his face remained in shadow. "Just heading back to our car," Chris replied, his voice steady despite the tension I could feel radiating from him. "Getting pretty dark for hiking." "Oh, I don't mind the dark," the man said, and there was something wrong about how he formed the words, as if he was trying to remember how human speech worked. "In fact, I prefer it. Helps you see things as they really are." He appeared to be typing something on his phone, but his fingers moved too rapidly, almost blur-like in their speed. Luna barked suddenly, a sharp, aggressive sound completely unlike her usual friendly woofing. "Ah, she's an ankle-biter," the man said, and I noticed he'd stopped pretending to use his phone. His head turned toward us with that same unnatural quickness, and for a moment, I thought I saw his eyes reflect the flashlight beam like an animal's. Every instinct was screaming at me to run. The rational part of my mind tried to argue that he was probably just an eccentric businessman taking a badly planned walk, but something deeper, more primitive, knew better. This wasn't right. He wasn't right. "We need to move, now." Chris's voice was barely a whisper, but the urgency in it spurred me into action. Without taking my flashlight off the man, we began backing away, trying to maintain what felt like a safe distance. The stranger remained perfectly still, his head cocked at that impossible angle, but I could feel his attention on us like a physical weight. Luna's growls had turned into a continuous low warning sound I'd never heard her make before, halfway between a whine and a snarl. When we were about 30 yards away, I saw his shoulders shift in a way that human shoulders shouldn't be able to move. That was all it took. Without a word, Chris and I turned and ran. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as we sprinted down the trail, casting crazy shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees casting them. Luna ran beside us, no longer growling but moving with focused intensity. The trail that we knew so well suddenly felt alien and treacherous. Roots seemed to appear out of nowhere, branches whipped at our faces. "Don't look back," Chris panted as we ran. "Whatever you do, don't look back." But of course I did. The man was following us, but not in any way that made sense. He moved in long, fluid strides that covered too much ground, his body swaying in a way that suggested extra joints or perhaps fewer than normal. He wasn't running exactly. It was more like he was flowing down the trail, eating up the distance between us with terrible efficiency. "He's gaining," I gasped, my lungs burning. The parking lot was still at least 5 minutes away at a normal pace. In the growing darkness, the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. Chris grabbed my arm, pulling me along faster. The flashlight beam caught glimpses of things moving in the forest beside the trail, shadows that didn't match the trees casting them, shapes that disappeared when looked at directly. The temperature had dropped even further, and our breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. Behind us I heard something that might have been laughter, but it sounded wrong, like someone trying to recreate the sound after only reading about it in books. It echoed through the trees in a way that violated the laws of acoustics, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Luna suddenly veered off the trail, taking a deer path that we knew was a shortcut to the parking lot. We followed without hesitation, crashing through underbrush and sliding down steep slopes. The route was treacherous in daylight. In near darkness, it was almost suicidal. But fear drove us forward. Fear of what was behind us. Fear of what would happen if it caught up. My flashlight caught glimpses of the man through the trees, but his movements made less and less sense. Sometimes he seemed to be on all fours, sometimes impossibly tall, his limbs too long and jointed in the wrong places. He never made any sound beyond that terrible not-quite laughter. But the forest itself seemed to react to his presence. Branches creaking in windless air, leaves rustling in unnatural patterns. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we burst out of the forest near the parking lot. The lot's single security light cast a sickly yellow glow over the nearly empty space. Our cars sat where we'd left them, and the dark sedan was gone. "Keys!" Chris gasped. "Get your keys out!" I fumbled in my pocket, nearly dropping them as my shaking hands tried to find the right one. We were almost to my Honda when I heard it, the sound of something emerging from the forest behind us. The man stepped out of the shadows, moving with that same fluid grace that suggested his bones weren't quite solid. He was walking directly toward us, covering ground far too quickly for his apparently casual pace. In the harsh parking lot light, his face looked wrong, the features slightly misaligned, as if they'd been arranged by someone who'd only seen humans in photographs. "Get in! Get in!" I fumbled with my keys, finally managing to unlock the doors. Chris practically threw Luna into the back seat before diving into the passenger side. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I nearly missed. The man was halfway across the parking lot now, and in the harsh fluorescent light, his movement became even more disturbing. Each step covered too much ground, as if the space between him and us was somehow condensing. His face had lost all pretense of humanity. The features seemed to shift and flow, like wax melting under intense heat. The engine roared to life just as he reached the back of the car. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of his eyes. No longer attempting to look human, they were silver white and had vertical pupils that reflected my taillights like a cat's. His mouth opened in what might have been a smile, revealing too many teeth arranged in ways that defied anatomy. "Drive!" Chris shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Luna was whimpering in the back seat, pressed as far away from the rear window as she could get. I slammed the car into reverse, then drive, tires squealing on the asphalt. As we peeled out of the parking lot, I saw the man standing perfectly still, watching us leave. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave, but his fingers moved independently of each other, like tentacles or serpents. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the drive, the only sounds being our ragged breathing and Luna's continued whimpers. I took a deliberately confusing route home, making random turns through residential neighborhoods, constantly checking the rearview mirror for headlights. Finally, Chris broke the silence. What was that?" I shook my head, unable to find words. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. "I don't know. I don't want to know." "Did you see how he moved? And his face?" Chris stopped, swallowing hard. His face wasn't right. That night, neither of us slept. I stayed at Chris's apartment, neither of us wanting to be alone. We sat in his living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. Luna refused to leave our sides, pressing herself against our legs as if trying to protect us. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone playing a cruel prank. Maybe the strange movements and impossible features were tricks of the light and our fear-addled minds. But we both knew better. What we'd encountered on that trail wasn't human, had probably never been human. The next day, we looked up the trail's history. What we found disturbed us even more. Over the past 50 years, there had been a series of disappearances in Oak Ridge State Park, always in the evening, always single hikers or pairs. The missing persons reports described similar details: a well-dressed man seen on the trail, strange movements, impossible speeds. We never hiked that trail again. Chris eventually moved to Portland for a new job, taking Luna with him. I switched to morning classes and bought a treadmill for exercise. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that evening. Sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night, I catch glimpses of someone walking with that same fluid grace, that same too-quick movement. And sometimes in my dreams, I hear that terrible not-quite laughter echoing through the trees. The flashlight my mother gave me sits in a drawer now, unused. But sometimes, late at night, I could swear I see its beam shining under the drawer's edge, as if it's turned itself on. And in those moments, I remember the way that thing's eyes reflected the light, and I wonder if by illuminating the darkness that night, we hadn't just revealed what was hiding there. We'd attracted its attention. Mom still asks why I don't hike anymore. I tell her I'm too busy, that I prefer the gym now. It's easier than explaining the truth, that some trails lead to places we're not meant to go, and some creatures that walk them were never meant to be seen by human eyes. But I know it's still out there, walking those darkening paths with its not-quite-human grace, waiting for more hikers to stay just a little too late on the trail. And sometimes, on particularly dark evenings, I think I see movement outside my window, a tall figure standing too still, watching with silver-white eyes that reflect light in ways they shouldn't. I stood in the cramped kitchen of the ranger station, scratching a mosquito bite on my neck and wishing I were anywhere else. My name is Charles Turner, and I am 71 years old. I've been with the United States Forest Service for nearly a decade, and in that time I've learned more than I ever thought possible about the wilderness and its ways. You learn a lot in this job: how to read a map by starlight, how to build a fire with wet wood, and how to tell when a search is going to end badly. But none of that prepared me for what I encountered in the Ozark National Forest. The day started like any other. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to filter through the trees as I arrived at the station. The air was thick with the promise of another sweltering Arkansas summer day. I nodded to Jake, the night shift ranger, as he gathered his things to head home. "Anything exciting happen last night, Jake?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the ancient percolator that had been in the station longer than I had. Jake shook his head, stifling a yawn. "Quiet as a graveyard, Charlie, just the way we like it." I chuckled, taking a sip of the strong, bitter brew. "Amen to that. Get some rest, kid." As Jake left, I settled into my morning routine. I checked the day's assignments, reviewed the weather report, sunny and hot as usual, and geared up for what I expected to be a routine day of patrols and minor emergencies. Little did I know that this day would be anything but routine. I was just about to head out when the phone rang. It was dispatch, and the news wasn't good. We had a report of a missing hiker, a college kid named Tyler Brinks. He'd gone off trail in the eastern section of the park, and his friends hadn't seen him for 2 days. Kid thought he was Bear Grylls or something, the dispatcher said, her voice tinged with a mixture of concern and exasperation. His buddies say he was bragging about how he could survive out there with just a Swiss Army knife in his wits. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. We got a few of these every year, overconfident hikers who thought they could take on Mother Nature and win. Sometimes we found them scared and humbled, sometimes injured but alive, and sometimes we didn't find them at all. "All right," I said. "I'll head out there now. Who's my partner on this one?" "Lena Barrow," came the reply. "She's already on her way to meet you at the trailhead." I nodded, even though the dispatcher couldn't see me. Lena was good people. A no-nonsense woman with a decade of experience and a reputation for finding people others couldn't. If anyone could help me find this kid, it was her. As I drove out to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way the morning mist clung to the trees longer than usual, or the eerie silence that seemed to blanket the forest. Whatever it was, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Lena was already there when I arrived, her beat-up Jeep parked next to my Forest Service truck. She was leaning against the hood, studying a map spread out on the vehicle's warm metal surface. "Morning, Charlie," she said without looking up. "Ready to go find our lost boy?" I grabbed my pack from the truck and joined her at the map. "As ready as I'll ever be. What have we got?" Lena pointed to a spot on the map. "His friends last saw him here, near the old mining trails. Said he was talking about exploring some caves he'd heard about." I frowned. The old mining area was treacherous, full of unstable ground, hidden sinkholes, and maze-like cave systems. If the kid had gone in there unprepared, his chances weren't good. "All right," I said, shouldering my pack. "Let's get moving. Daylight's burning." As we set off into the forest, the sun was just starting to climb, casting long shadows that made the trees look like towering sentinels. The air was thick with humidity, and the relentless buzzing of insects filled the silence between our footsteps. "Got a bad feeling about this one, Charlie," Lena said as we pushed through the underbrush. I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. "Yeah, me too. But let's hope he's just lost and not hurt." Little did we know, as we ventured deeper into the Ozark wilderness, that we were about to uncover something far more terrifying than a lost hiker. Something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the forest we called home. The forest seemed to close in around us as we made our way deeper into the wilderness. The well-maintained trails gave way to overgrown paths, barely visible beneath years of fallen leaves and encroaching vegetation. We called out Tyler's name every few minutes, our voices echoing through the trees before being swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. As we hiked, I found myself thinking about all the searches I'd been on over the years. Some had happy endings, lost hikers found safe and sound, maybe a little hungry and scared, but no worse for wear. Others, well, those were the ones that haunted my dreams, the ones where we found only silence and sorrow. "You're awful quiet, Charlie," Lena said, breaking me out of my reverie. "Penny for your thoughts?" I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about past searches. You know how it is." Lena nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd been on enough of these missions to know the weight they carried. "Yeah, I know, but we can't let that get in our heads. We've got a job to do." She was right, of course. I pushed the dark thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. We had a young man to find, and every minute counted. As the day wore on, the terrain became increasingly difficult. We scrambled up steep inclines, fought our way through dense thickets, and carefully navigated around treacherous sinkholes. The heat was oppressive, the humidity making it feel like we were wading through soup. It was mid-afternoon when we found our first sign of Tyler. A torn piece of fabric, blue with white stripes, snagged on a thorny branch. "Look familiar?" I asked, holding it up for Lena to see. She nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Yeah, matches the description of the shirt his friend said he was wearing. We must be on the right track." Energized by this small discovery, we pressed on with renewed vigor. But as the hours passed and the sun began to dip towards the horizon, that initial burst of optimism began to fade. We stopped for a quick break, gulping down water and forcing ourselves to eat some trail mix. The forest had grown eerily quiet, the usual chorus of birds and insects conspicuously absent. "Charlie," Lena said, her voice low and tense, "does something feel off to you?" I nodded, glad I wasn't the only one who felt it. "Yeah, it's too quiet, like the whole forest is holding its breath." Just then, Lena's radio crackled to life, making us both jump. It was base camp asking for an update. As Lena filled them in on our progress, or lack thereof, I scanned our surroundings, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. "They want us to push a bit further east, towards the river," Lena said after ending the call. Apparently, Tyler was talking about fishing there before he disappeared. I checked my watch, frowning. "We've only got a couple hours of daylight left. If we don't find anything by the river, we'll have to head back and resume the search tomorrow." Lena nodded, her expression grim. We both knew that every hour that passed reduced Tyler's chances of survival. If he was injured or trapped somewhere, time was not on our side. We set off towards the river, the terrain growing even more challenging. The incline steepened, and we had to use our hands to scramble up rocky outcroppings. My muscles ached, reminding me that I wasn't as young as I used to be. As we neared the river, the dense forest began to thin out. That's when we came across something that made my blood run cold. There, cutting through the undergrowth, was an old, overgrown trail. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but recent disturbances in the vegetation suggested someone had passed through recently. "Do you think he came this way?" Lena asked, voicing the thought we were both having. I nodded slowly. "It's possible. Let's check it out." We followed the trail for about a mile, our senses on high alert. The fading light cast long shadows, making every tree stump and boulder look like a crouched figure. Then, suddenly, we stumbled upon a sight that stopped us in our tracks. In a small clearing, barely visible through the encroaching vegetation, was a campsite. It was clear that someone had been there recently. The fire pit still held the remnants of warm ashes, and fresh footprints marked the soft earth. But it wasn't these signs of recent habitation that sent a chill down my spine. It was the eerie silence that hung over the place, and the overwhelming sense that we were not alone. "Tyler?" Lena called out, her voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. "Tyler Brinks? We're with the Forest Service. If you can hear us, please respond." Only silence answered her call. We began to search the area methodically, looking for any sign of the missing hiker. It didn't take long to find something, but it wasn't what we were hoping for. "Charlie?" Lena called, her voice tight with tension. "Over here." I made my way over to where she was standing, and my heart sank. There, half buried under some leaves as if someone had hastily tried to conceal it, was a backpack. It matched the description of the one Tyler had been carrying. As we examined the backpack, it became clear that something violent had happened here. The pack was ripped open, its contents scattered around the clearing, and then we saw it. A dark stain on the ground near the backpack. Blood. "Jesus," Lena muttered, her face pale in the fading light. "This doesn't look good." I nodded grimly, my mind racing. This was no longer a simple search and rescue. Whatever had happened here, it was clear that Tyler was in serious trouble, if he was still alive at all. As the realization of what we might be dealing with sank in, A sound echoed through the forest, a low, guttural noise unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a sound that would haunt my nightmares for years to come, a sound that marked the beginning of a nightmare that was only just beginning. The sound hung in the air, a primal growl that seemed to vibrate through the very trees around us. Lena and I exchanged a glance, both of us reaching for our radios. But before we could call for backup, chaos erupted. Something large and fast barreled through the bushes, a blur of movement that was on us before we could react. I heard Lena cry out, saw her knocked to the ground by a massive shape. In the fading light, I caught a glimpse of fur and teeth, and then it was gone, disappearing back into the forest as quickly as it had appeared. "Lena!" I shouted, rushing to her side. She was already pushing herself up, her face a mask of pain and shock. "I'm okay," she gasped, but I could see blood dripping from a gash on her arm. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know, but it's not like any animal I've ever seen in these parts." We quickly patched up Lena's wound as best we could with our first aid kit. The cut was deep, but thankfully it had missed any major blood vessels. Still, the risk of infection out here was high. "We need to get out of here," I said, scanning the darkening forest around us. "Whatever that thing was, it's still out there." Lena nodded, wincing as she tested her injured arm. "Agreed. But what about Tyler?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications. Our job was to find the missing hiker, but we were clearly out of our depth here. Whatever had attacked us was unlike anything we'd encountered before, and the violence of the campsite suggested Tyler's situation was dire, if he was even still alive. "We head back to the campsite," I decided. "It's more open there, and we can defend it better if that thing comes back. We'll radio for immediate backup and wait for extraction." It was a hard decision, knowing we might be leaving Tyler to his fate, but we had no choice. We couldn't help him if we ended up as victims ourselves. The trek back to the campsite was tense, every snapping twig and rustling leaf setting our nerves on edge. The forest, which had seemed merely indifferent before, now felt actively hostile. Shadows seemed to move at the corners of our vision, and that low, guttural sound echoed through the trees more than once, always seeming to come from a different direction. When we finally reached the campsite, night had fully fallen. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the clearing, turning familiar shapes into looming monsters. We quickly set about securing the area, gathering what dry wood we could find to build up the fire. As the flames grew, pushing back the darkness, I pulled out my radio. "Base camp, this is Ranger Turner. We have an emergency situation. Over." The radio crackled, and a voice came through, distorted by static. "This is base camp. Go ahead, Ranger Turner." I took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to explain what we'd encountered without sounding crazy. "We've found signs of violence at a campsite near the old mining trails. Ranger Barrow has been injured by an unknown animal, possibly the same one responsible for the disturbance at the campsite. We require immediate extraction and backup. The missing hiker, Tyler Brinks, is still unaccounted for." There was a long pause, and for a moment I feared the transmission hadn't gone through. Then the radio crackled again. "Copy that, Ranger Turner. Sit tight. We're sending a team your way. ETA 2 hours. Can you provide any more details on the animal that attacked you?" I looked at Lena, who shook her head slightly. How could we describe something we'd barely seen? "Negative, base camp," I replied. "It was fast and large, but we didn't get a good look at it. Exercise extreme caution when approaching the area." "Understood. Stay safe and keep that fire burning. We'll be there as soon as we can." As I put the radio away, Lena spoke up. 2 hours. That's a long time to be sitting ducks out here, Charlie." I nodded grimly. "I know, but we don't have much choice. How's the arm?" She flexed it carefully, wincing. "Hurts like hell, but I'll live." Assuming that thing doesn't come back to finish the job, we fell into an uneasy silence. both of us scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. In any other circumstance, it might have been peaceful, but now, every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a potential attack. As we waited, I couldn't help but think about Tyler. Was he out there somewhere, hurt and alone? Or had he already fallen victim to whatever creature was stalking these woods? The thought of having to tell his family that we'd failed to find him weighed heavily on my mind. "Charlie?" Lena's voice broke through my dark thoughts. "Over there. Do you see that?" I followed her gaze to the edge of the clearing. At first I saw nothing but shadows and underbrush. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something was moving just beyond the reach of our firelight. We both stood, reaching for our weapons. The movement stopped, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness. My heart leapt into my throat. Was it Tyler? Had he somehow found his way to us? But as the figure came into the light, I realized with a growing sense of horror that this was not Tyler. It wasn't human at all. The creature that stood at the edge of our camp was like nothing I had ever seen before. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body covered in dark, matted fur. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in wickedly curved claws that gleamed in the firelight. But it was the creature's face that truly chilled me to the bone. Its features were a nightmarish blend of human and animal. Eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence were set deep in a face that was vaguely ursine, yet disturbingly humanoid. Its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth, and as it opened its maw to let out a low, rumbling growl, I could see that its canines were unnaturally long and sharp. "Jesus Christ," Lena whispered beside me, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. For what felt like an eternity, we stood frozen, locked in a silent standoff with the creature. It watched us with those eerily intelligent eyes, and I had the unsettling feeling that it was sizing us up, deciding whether we were worth the effort of an attack. Slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, I reached for my rifle. The creature's eyes followed my movement, a low growl rumbling from its chest. "Easy," I murmured, as much to myself as to the beast before us. "Easy now." Just as my hand closed around the stock of my rifle, the creature made its move. With a speed that seemed impossible for something of its size, it lunged forward, covering the distance between us in a heartbeat. Lena reacted first, firing off a shot that echoed through the clearing like a thunderclap. The creature roared in pain and fury as the bullet found its mark, but it didn't slow down. I barely had time to bring my own weapon to bear before it was upon us. What followed was a chaotic blur of fur, claws, and gunfire. Lena and I fought desperately, emptying our weapons into the beast as it slashed and bit at us with inhuman strength. I felt its claws rake across my back, tearing through my jacket like it was tissue paper, and pain exploded across my body. Just when I thought we were done for, when my arms felt like lead and my vision was blurring from pain and exhaustion, the creature suddenly reared back. It let out a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet, then turned and bounded off into the forest, disappearing into the darkness as swiftly as it had appeared. For a moment, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and my own ragged breathing. Then Lena's voice cut through the haze. "Charlie? Charlie, are you all right?" I turned to her, wincing at the movement. She looked as bad as I felt, her clothes torn and bloody, a nasty gash across her forehead. "I'm alive," I managed to croak out. "You?" She nodded grimly. "Been better. What the hell was that thing?" Before I could answer, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. The backup we'd called for had finally arrived. The next few hours passed in a blur. We were airlifted out of the forest and rushed to the nearest hospital. As the doctors patched us up, we gave our statements to a parade of increasingly high-ranking officials. Forest Service, state police, even a couple of suits that I strongly suspected were FBI. We told them everything about finding Tyler's campsite, the attack, the creature we'd encountered. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, but the evidence of our injuries and the shell casings littering the campsite were hard to dismiss. Days turned into weeks. The search for Tyler Brinks continued, but as time passed, hope faded. They found more bodies in the forest, some fresh, some old, all bearing the same horrific injuries that Lena and I had narrowly escaped. The official story was that a large, unidentified predator was responsible for the attacks. The Ozark National Forest was closed to the public pending a full investigation. But I knew, as did Lena and anyone else who had seen that creature up close, that what we'd encountered was no ordinary animal. As for me, I recovered from my injuries, but something changed in me that night. The forest, which had once been a place of solace and wonder, now held a darkness I couldn't ignore. I found myself jumping at shadows, seeing glowing eyes in every patch of darkness. Lena transferred to a different park, unable to face the memories of what we'd encountered. I couldn't blame her. There were times I thought about leaving too, about hanging up my ranger hat and never setting foot in those woods again. But in the end, I stayed. Someone had to keep watch, to be ready if that thing ever came back. And deep down I knew it would. Whatever it was, animal, monster, or something in between, it was still out there, waiting in the shadows of the Ozark Forest. The case remains open, the truth hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and disbelief. But I know what I saw, what I fought. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees and shadows seem to move of their own accord, I stand at the edge of the forest and listen, listening for that low, guttural growl that haunts my dreams, waiting for the day when the shadow in the Ozarks emerges once again. It's been 5 years since that fateful night in the Ozark National Forest. The scars on my body have faded to silvery lines, but the memories remain as sharp as ever. The forest has long since reopened to the public, the official investigation concluding that the attacks were the work of a large, unidentified predator, likely a bear or mountain lion driven to unusual aggression by environmental factors. But I know the truth, and I'm not the only one. Over the years, I've heard whispers, stories told in hushed voices around campfires or in the dim light of backwoods bars, tales of a creature that walks like a man but hunts like a beast, of hikers gone missing and campsites found torn apart. The locals have taken to calling it the Ozark Howler, a name that sends shivers down the spines of even the most hardened outdoorsmen. I've stayed on as a ranger, unable to leave the forest I've called home for so long. But my job has changed. Officially, I'm still here to protect the forest and its visitors. Unofficially, I'm a sentinel, always watching, always listening for signs of the creature's return. Lena and I keep in touch. She's doing well in her new post in the Pacific Northwest, but I can hear the tension in her voice whenever our conversations drift back to that night. She's found peace by putting distance between herself and the memories. I've found mine by staying close, by facing the darkness head on. As for Tyler Brinks, his body was never found. His family still holds out hope, but I know the truth. I've seen what that creature can do. Sometimes on my patrols I find myself at the site of that old campsite. The forest has reclaimed it now, erasing almost all signs of the violence that occurred there. Almost, but not quite. If you know where to look, you can still see the scars. Just last week I found fresh tracks near the old mining trails. Huge prints, too big for any normal animal, with claw marks that sent a chill down my spine. I reported it, of course, but I know nothing will come of it. The higher-ups are too invested in their official story to acknowledge the truth. So I'll keep watching, keep patrolling, keep listening for that bone-chilling howl in the night. Because I know that somewhere out there, in the deep, dark heart of the Ozarks, a monster is waiting. And when it decides to make its presence known again, I'll be ready. After all, that's what being a forest ranger is all about. We're the first line of defense between the wilderness and civilization, between the known and the unknown. And sometimes that means facing monsters, both the four-legged kind and the ones that walk on two legs but aren't quite human. As I write this, the sun is setting over the Ozarks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Soon, night will fall, and the forest will come alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. And among those familiar noises, I'll be listening for something else. Something that doesn't belong. Because the shadow in the Ozarks is still out there, and one day, it will return. And when it does, I'll be here ready to face it once again. It was the spring of 2006, and I was a 16-year-old Native American teenager from Oregon. Like many of my peers, I was eager to embrace our cultural heritage and learn more about our traditions. When the opportunity arose to join a youth camping trip led by some of our tribal elders during spring break, I jumped at the chance. Little did I know that this trip would leave an indelible mark on my psyche, shaping my understanding of our spiritual beliefs and the unseen world around us. Our group consisted of about a dozen teenagers and 3 respected tribal leaders. We packed our gear into a couple of old vans and set off for the lush forests that our ancestors had called home for countless generations. The drive was filled with excited chatter and laughter as we wound our way through winding roads, the scenery gradually changing from suburban sprawl to dense, towering trees. After a few hours, we arrived at our campsite, a small clearing nestled among ancient cedars and Douglas firs. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. We spent the afternoon setting up our tents, gathering firewood, and preparing for the days ahead. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, we gathered around the campfire. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the faces of my friends and elders. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, sharing stories and jokes. The mood was light and carefree, a stark contrast to the weight of the lesson I was about to receive. As the night wore on and the initial excitement began to wane, a comfortable silence fell over our group. Without thinking, I started to whistle a tune, just a simple melody I'd picked up somewhere. The sound seemed to pierce the quiet of the forest, echoing slightly in the clearing. Suddenly, one of our tribal leaders, an older man named Robert with deep-set eyes and weathered skin, shot me a sharp look. "Stop that," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't whistle at night." Confused and a little embarrassed, I immediately fell silent. The other teenagers looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. Robert's expression softened slightly as he saw my discomfort, and he motioned for us all to gather closer. "There's a reason we don't whistle at night," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "It's a lesson passed down through generations, a warning about the delicate balance between our world and the spirit world." As Robert spoke, the forest around us seemed to grow quieter, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to listen. He explained that in our native traditions, we believe that the nighttime belongs to the spirits. It's their time to roam freely, to exist without the interference of the living. By going to sleep at night, we show respect for this arrangement, giving the spirits the space they need. But, Robert warned, there are consequences for those who disrupt this balance. He spoke of creatures known as the stick people, entities that serve as guardians of the spirit world's time. These beings, he said, are drawn to those who make noise at night, particularly whistling. "The stick people," Robert continued, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "They're not evil, but they're not kind either. They're protectors of a boundary we must respect. When someone whistles at night, it's like a beacon to them. They come to investigate, to silence the disturbance." He went on to describe how the stick people would lure unwary individuals deeper into the forest, leading them astray until they were hopelessly lost. Some stories told of people disappearing for days, others for weeks. A few, he said in a hushed tone, were never seen again. As Robert spoke, I could feel a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The forest around us, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt alive with unseen presences. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump slightly. "But why whistling?" one of my friends asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded, acknowledging the question. "Whistling carries far in the quiet of night," he explained. "It's a human sound, unmistakable. To the spirits, it's like shining a bright light into a dark room, disruptive and disrespectful." He went on to share other traditional beliefs about nighttime behavior. We learned that it was considered unwise to call out someone's name after dark, as this could attract unwanted attention from spirits. Looking into mirrors at night was discouraged, as they were seen as potential portals to the spirit world. As Robert spoke, I found myself reflecting on the deeper meaning behind these beliefs. They weren't just superstitions, I realized, but a complex system of respect and balance with the natural and spiritual world. Our ancestors had developed these traditions as a way of living in harmony with forces beyond our understanding. The night wore on, and Robert's stories continued. He spoke of other spiritual entities from our traditions, both benevolent and malevolent. He told us of shapeshifters who could take on animal forms, of guardian spirits who watched over our people, and of trickster figures who taught lessons through mischief and chaos. As I listened, I felt a growing sense of connection to my heritage. These weren't just stories, they were a link to countless generations before me, a way of understanding the world that had been passed down through the ages. I began to see the forest around us not just as a collection of trees and animals, but as a living, breathing entity filled with unseen forces and ancient wisdom. The fire began to die down, and Robert's voice grew softer. "Remember," he said, looking each of us in the eye, "these traditions aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to teach respect for the land, for the spirits, for the delicate balance of the world around us. When you whistle at night, you're not just making noise, you're disrupting that balance." As we prepared for bed that night, the forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. The rustling of leaves in the breeze sounded like whispered conversations. The shadows cast by our flashlights seemed to move with a life of their own. I found myself hesitating before stepping outside my tent, scanning the darkness for any sign of the stick people. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the forest, I reflected on what I'd learned. The story of the stick people and the warning against whistling at night wasn't just a scary tale to keep kids in line. It was a window into a worldview that saw humans as just one part of a vast, interconnected universe. It was a reminder of the importance of respect, of living in harmony with the world around us, both seen and unseen. In the days that followed, our camping trip continued. We hiked through ancient forests, learned traditional skills like identifying edible plants and reading animal tracks, and shared more stories around the campfire each night. But that first night's lesson stayed with me, coloring every experience. I found myself moving more quietly through the forest, aware that I was a guest in an ancient and sacred place. I paid closer attention to the world around me, not just looking at the trees and animals, but feeling the energy of the land itself. And each night, as darkness fell, I remembered the story of the stick people and the importance of respecting the spirit's time. As the years have passed, I've carried that lesson with me. Even now, living in a modern world far removed from that forest campsite, I find myself hesitating before whistling at night. The story has become a part of me, a constant reminder of my heritage and the wisdom of my ancestors. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I think back to that camping trip. I remember the warmth of the fire, the sound of Robert's voice, and the feeling of being connected to something ancient and profound. And in those moments, I understand why we tell these stories, why we pass down these traditions. They're not just tales to frighten children or quaint superstitions. They're a way of understanding the world, of maintaining balance, and of keeping alive a worldview that sees magic and meaning in the natural world. The lesson I learned that night goes beyond not whistling after dark. It's about respect for nature, for spirits, for traditions, and for the delicate balance of the world around us. It's a reminder that we are not the masters of this world, but a part of it, with responsibilities and obligations to the seen and unseen alike. As I've grown older, I've come to appreciate the depth of wisdom in our native traditions. What once seemed like simple rules or scary stories now reveal themselves as complex systems of knowledge, built up over countless generations. They encode not just spiritual beliefs, but practical wisdom about living in harmony with the natural world. The story of the Stick People, for instance, isn't just about supernatural beings in the forest. It's a way of teaching the importance of silence and respect in nature, of not disturbing wildlife or other campers, of being aware of one's surroundings. The tradition of not calling out names at night, a practical way to avoid attracting predators or getting separated from your group in the darkness. These days, when I find myself in nature, whether it's a weekend camping trip or just a walk in a city park, I carry these lessons with me. I move with more awareness, more respect. I listen to the world around me, not just with my ears, but with my whole being. And yes, I still refrain from whistling at night. But more than that, I've learned to see the world through a lens of interconnectedness. Every action has a reaction. Every disturbance ripples out in ways we might not immediately see. This understanding has influenced how I live my life, how I interact with others, how I think about my place in the world. As I reflect on that camping trip now, years later, I'm filled with gratitude. Gratitude for Robert and the other tribal elders who took the time to pass on these traditions. Gratitude for the wisdom of my ancestors, preserved and passed down through generations. And gratitude for that moment of thoughtless whistling that opened the door to a deeper understanding of my heritage and the world around me. The story of the Stick People and that night around the campfire have become a touchstone for me, a memory I return to again and again. It reminds me of who I am and where I come from. It connects me to my past and guides me in my present. And every time I catch myself about to whistle at night, I smile, remembering the lessons learned in a forest clearing under a starry sky. In the end, these traditions, whether they're about Stick People, whistling at night, or any of the countless other beliefs and practices passed down through generations, are more than just stories. They're a way of seeing the world, a reminder of our place in it, and a guide for living in harmony with all that surrounds us, both seen and unseen. And that, I believe, is a lesson worth carrying forward, no matter where life may take us. Most people don't understand why I love hunting so much. They see it as primitive, even cruel. But they've never experienced the profound silence of dawn in the forest, or felt that deep connection to something ancient and pure that stirs in your blood when you're alone in the wilderness. My name is Vito Carswell, and until last October, I'd spent nearly every weekend of the past 20 years in the dense forests surrounding Black Ridge, Pennsylvania. I learned to hunt from my grandfather Vincent, who taught me everything he knew about tracking, about reading the forest, and about respecting the land. The woods have their own rules, he used to say, his weathered face serious beneath his worn canvas hat. Break them at your peril. I was 12 when he first took me hunting, and 42 when I saw the thing that made me give it up forever. The day started like any other autumn morning in the Allegheny Nashmo forest. I'd arrived at my usual spot well before sunrise, parking my old Ford pickup at the end of a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct October chill that makes your breath visible in thin, wispy clouds. I'd been tracking a particular buck for weeks, a massive 12-pointer that had become something of an obsession. I'd seen him 3 times before, always at a distance, always one step ahead of me. I remember checking my pack one last time before heading out. Water, first aid kit, emergency blanket, knife, matches in a waterproof case, and enough provisions to last 2 days if needed. You don't take chances in these woods. They stretch for hundreds of miles, and it's easier than most people realize to get turned around. My Remington 700 was a comfortable weight against my shoulder, the woodstock smooth from years of use. The first few hours were uneventful. I followed my usual route, moving slowly through the undergrowth, reading signs that most people would miss: broken twigs, displaced leaves, the subtle indicators of animal movement. The forest canopy was thick enough that, even at mid-morning, the light that filtered through was dim and patchy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. It was around 11:30 when I first noticed something was off. I'd been walking for about 6 hours, following what I thought were fresh deer tracks, when I realized the forest had gone quiet. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that silence isn't natural. There should always be background noise: birds, insects, the rustle of small animals. But here, in this section of the forest, there was nothing. I found the clearing shortly after that. It wasn't large, maybe 30 feet across, but something about it made me stop dead in my tracks. The trees surrounding it were wrong. I've seen my share of bear markings, but these were different. The scratches started about 6 feet up the trunks and ran down to about knee height, deep enough that some of them had gone through to the pale wood beneath the bark. They formed patterns, not random marks, but deliberate arrangements that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. I've spent my entire adult life in these woods. I know every type of marking an animal can make, every pattern that weather or insects or disease can create. These were something else entirely. They had a precision to them, a geometric quality that wasn't natural. Some of the marks looked fresh, others were older, the wood around them graying and dead. I should have turned back then. Everything I'd learned about the forest, every instinct honed over decades of hunting, was screaming at me to leave. But curiosity is a powerful force, and I'd convinced myself there had to be a rational explanation. I took out my phone and tried to photograph the markings, but every picture came out blurry, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on the patterns. The temperature seemed to drop as I examined the clearing. The air felt heavier, almost pressurized, like the atmosphere before a severe storm. I noticed other details that I'd missed at first. The ground was bare, with no leaf litter or undergrowth, just packed earth that looked almost polished in places. The trees at the edge of the clearing were twisted, their trunks corkscrewing in ways that seemed impossible. I was about to leave when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It started as a low frequency, more felt than heard, like the rumble of distant thunder. But it changed, modulating into something that resembled speech, if speech could exist without a human throat to produce it. The sound had patterns, rhythms that seemed almost familiar but refused to resolve into anything recognizable. My hands were shaking as I raised my rifle. The weight of it was reassuring, but I knew somehow that it would be useless against whatever was making that sound. The noise grew louder, and with it came a smell. Not the decay you sometimes find in the woods, but something chemical, like ozone and copper and rot all mixed together. When it emerged from between the trees, my mind initially refused to process what I was seeing. The human brain tries to make sense of things by relating them to familiar objects, but there was nothing familiar about this. It moved like something that had learned about walking by watching it done badly. All wrong angles and jerky movements that shouldn't have allowed for forward progress. Its height was hard to judge because it seemed to shift, its form rippling like heat waves off hot asphalt. The closest I can come to describing its appearance is to say it looked like something trying to wear the shape of a person, but getting all the proportions wrong. Its skin, if you could call it that, had a texture that changed as it moved, sometimes appearing rough and scaly, other times smooth and reflective like wet stone. But it was the eyes that broke me. Not because they were alien or monstrous, but because they were almost human. Dark, intelligent, and filled with an awareness that made my blood run cold. They focused on me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was being recognized not just as prey, but as something to be studied. I fired. The sound of the shot was shockingly loud in the unnatural silence, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it moved toward me with a speed that shouldn't have been possible given its awkward gait. I fired again and again, each shot finding its mark but seeming to pass through the thing as if it were smoke. The attack, when it came, was almost gentle. One moment I was standing, rifle raised, and the next I was on the ground, my chest burning where its claws, appendages, whatever they were, had struck me. My heavy hunting jacket was shredded, and beneath it, my skin was laid open in long, precise cuts that barely bled. I rolled to my feet, decades of hunting having taught me how to fall without letting go of my rifle. The creature was between me and the way I'd come in, so I ran deeper into the forest. I heard it behind me, moving through the trees with that same impossible speed. The forest blurred around me as I ran, my boots finding purchase on the leaf-covered ground more by luck than skill. I fell twice. The first time I managed to keep going. The second time I slammed hard into a tree, the impact driving the air from my lungs. As I struggled to breathe, I heard it getting closer. That's when I saw the rock formation, a natural outcropping that had been split, creating a narrow crevice just wide enough for a person. I don't remember making the decision to hide. One moment I was standing, the next I was wedged into the crevice, my back pressed against cold stone, my rifle clutched uselessly against my chest. The creature arrived seconds later. I could see parts of it through the gap, fragments of its form that my mind couldn't quite piece together into a whole. It moved around the rocks for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sometimes I could see those two human eyes studying my hiding place, and other times it seemed to lose coherence entirely, becoming a shifting mass of angles and surfaces that made my vision blur. Eventually it left. I didn't see it go. One moment it was there, and the next it wasn't. The forest remained silent. I stayed in that crevice until my legs cramped and my arms went numb from holding the rifle. When I finally forced myself to move, the sun was setting. The walk back to my truck was the longest journey of my life. Every shadow held potential horrors. Every sound made me flinch. I kept the rifle raised, though I knew now it would be useless if the creature returned. By the time I reached the logging road, I was running on pure adrenaline. I didn't go to the hospital right away. Instead, I drove home, cleaned the cuts on my chest, which had barely bled and were already starting to close in a way that didn't look natural, and spent the night sitting in my kitchen with every light in the house turned on, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I called the state police and reported what I'd seen. They were professional but skeptical, especially when I couldn't lead them back to the clearing. I tried twice to find it again, with search parties accompanying me, but the forest had changed. Landmarks I'd known for decades seemed to have shifted, and paths I could have walked blindfolded led nowhere. I sold my house in Blackridge 3 months later. The cuts on my chest had healed without scarring, leaving only faint lines that sometimes seemed to shift when I looked at them directly. I moved to Pittsburgh, took a job in an office, and tried to convince myself that what I'd experienced had been some kind of mental break, that there had to be a rational explanation. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that sound again, that almost speech that vibrates in your bones, and I know it's out there in those deep woods waiting. Maybe it's still studying me, learning from our encounter just as I learned from it. The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at my ceiling, wondering if someday it will come looking for me. I still have my grandfather's words echoing in my head. The woods have their own rules. I broke them that day, ventured too deep into something I wasn't meant to understand. I survived, but that survival came with a price, the loss of certainty, of the comfortable belief that I understood the world and my place in it. Most people go their entire lives without experiencing anything truly extraordinary. They live in a world where everything can be explained, categorized, understood. Sometimes I envy them. But then I look at the faint lines on my chest, watch them shift in the mirror when I'm not quite looking directly at them, and I remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation. I survived an encounter with one of them, but I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if it was really me who was being hunted that day, or if I was just being observed, studied, learned from. And sometimes when the wind blows just right and I catch a faint smell of ozone and copper, I wonder if the learning is still going on. It was the mid-1980s, and my grandmother's 1979 Ford Thunderbird was a sight to behold. The car boasted a pristine white vinyl top, its body gleaming in a light metallic red that caught the eye of everyone who passed by. Chrome accents adorned the vehicle, giving it an air of elegance that was hard to miss. One evening, as twilight began to settle over our rural community, my grandmother needed to visit someone's house. She cranked up her beloved Thunderbird and set off down the winding country roads. Living in such a remote area meant that neighbors were few and far between, and the sparse placement of power lines made for nights that grew dark quickly and intensely. As she drove, the last remnants of daylight faded, plunging the landscape into an inky blackness. The headlights of her Thunderbird cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. She approached a notorious incline known locally as Rock Hill. This wasn't just any hill. It was a beast of a climb, with an incline of about 80%. It was so steep that local football players and fitness enthusiasts would use it for conditioning, either running or cycling up its punishing slope. My grandmother pressed on, the Thunderbird's engine purring as it tackled the steep grade. She made it to the crest of the hill where the road leveled out, feeling a sense of accomplishment at conquering the climb. But her triumph was short-lived. Without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. The dashboard lights flickered and went dark. She turned the key in the ignition, but nothing happened. The battery had gone kaput, or perhaps it was the starter. Concerned, but not panicked, my grandmother stepped out of the car to investigate. She popped the hood and checked the battery cables, finding them secure and showing no signs of corrosion or damage. Everything seemed to be in order, which only deepened the mystery of why her reliable Thunderbird had chosen this moment to fail her. As she stood there in the dark, a realization slowly crept over her. The night was eerily quiet, too quiet. The usual symphony of crickets and nightbirds was conspicuously absent, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against her eardrums. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly retreated to the safety of her car, locking the doors behind her. Inside the Thunderbird, my grandmother waited, hoping another vehicle would pass by and offer assistance. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling longer than the last. She strained her eyes, peering into the darkness beyond the car's windows, willing a pair of headlights to appear on the horizon. That's when she noticed it. A shadow. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of her imagination, a product of her heightened anxiety and the play of moonlight on the trees. But as she watched, the shadow moved. It wasn't the gentle swaying of branches in the breeze, but a deliberate, purposeful movement. The shadow drew closer to the car, its form becoming more defined with each step. My grandmother's heart raced as she realized this was no ordinary shadow. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist outside of campfire tales and horror movies. The figure approached the driver's side door, towering over the Thunderbird. With trembling hands, my grandmother reached for the flashlight she kept in the glove compartment. She fumbled with the switch, finally managing to turn it on, and directed the beam towards the window. What she saw in that moment would haunt her for years to come. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, its massive frame dwarfing the car. Its body was covered in thick matted fur, a rich camel brown color that seemed to absorb the flashlight's beam. Around its eyes, palms, and belly, the fur was a lighter shade, creating an unsettling contrast. My grandmother's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The creature's face was unlike anything she had ever encountered. It had an almost human-like quality to its features, but distorted and elongated in a way that was decidedly inhuman. Its eyes reflected the flashlight's beam, 2 pinpoints of light that seemed to bore into her very soul. For what felt like an eternity, my grandmother and the creature regarded each other. She sat frozen in her seat, hardly daring to breathe, while the being outside peered curiously into the car. It made no aggressive moves, but its mere presence was terrifying enough. Eventually, after what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, the creature turned and lumbered back into the darkness. My grandmother remained in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She didn't move until the first rays of dawn began to lighten the sky, afraid that any movement might attract the creature's attention once more. When she finally felt safe enough to leave the car, she managed to flag down a passing truck. The driver, a kind older man, helped her jump-start the Thunderbird. As the engine roared back to life, my grandmother couldn't shake the feeling that she had experienced something beyond the realm of normal explanation. She drove home in a daze, the events of the night replaying in her mind. When she arrived, she shared her story with the family, her voice shaking as she recounted the details of her encounter. Some were skeptical, suggesting she had dozed off and had a particularly vivid nightmare. Others listened with wide-eyed fascination, peppering her with questions about every aspect of the creature. As for me, I didn't know what to think. My grandmother had always been a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy or tall tales. The fear in her eyes as she told her story was genuine, and I couldn't help but believe that she had experienced something truly extraordinary that night on Rock Hill. Little did I know that years later, I would have my own encounter with something that defied explanation. It was a crisp winter morning, and I was driving to work. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, its weak light doing little to dispel the lingering darkness. I had my headlights on, more out of habit than necessity at this point. As I approached a sharp curve in the road, something caught my eye. At first I thought it might be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees that lined the road. But as I drew closer, I realized I was looking at something solid, something very much alive. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a creature that seemed to have stepped out of a cryptozoologist's wildest dreams. It stood well over 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick fur. Unlike the creature my grandmother had described, this one's fur was a deep charcoal gray, with patches of jet black on its back and stomach. I slowed the car, my foot hovering over the brake pedal as I tried to process what I was seeing. The creature turned its head towards me, its eyes reflecting the glare of my headlights. For a moment we stared at each other, two beings from different worlds meeting on this lonely stretch of road. Then, with a casual grace that belied its massive size, the creature turned and walked into the woods. Its movements were smooth and deliberate, showing no sign of fear or aggression. In a matter of seconds, it had disappeared into the tree line, leaving me to question whether I had really seen anything at all. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to get out of the car and investigate, to find some trace of the creature's passage, but a larger part, the part driven by self-preservation, urged me to drive on and pretend nothing had happened. In the end, I chose the latter option. I put the car in gear and continued on my way to work, my mind racing with questions I knew I couldn't answer. When I got home that evening, I told my wife about what I had seen. To her credit, she listened without judgment, her eyes wide with a mix of fascination and concern. We agreed it was strange but didn't dwell on it, instead falling back into our daily routine. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes reflecting in my headlights, or the casual way the creature had sauntered back into the forest. A week after my encounter, I decided to go for a walk up the road where I had seen the creature. Part of me hoped to find some evidence of its existence, a footprint, a tuft of fur, anything that would prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. As I walked, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The woods seemed quieter than usual, the typical sounds of birds and small animals conspicuously absent. I felt as if I was being watched, unseen eyes following my every move from the dense foliage that lined the road. A sense of fear and dread began to creep over me, but I pushed it aside, determined to continue my investigation. I tried to maintain a calm exterior, even as my heart raced and my palms grew sweaty. That's when I heard it, a rhythmic beating sound coming from the trees. At first I thought it might be a woodpecker, but the sound was too loud, too deliberate. It was as if something was striking the trees with great force, perhaps as a warning or a form of communication. Then I saw the stones. They came sailing out of the woods, landing on the road around me. They weren't aimed at me directly, but their presence was unsettling nonetheless. It was clear that something was trying to get my attention, to let me know that I was not alone on this lonely stretch of road. I quickened my pace, no longer interested in finding evidence. My only goal now was to reach the end of the road and turn back towards home. The beating on the trees continued, seemingly following me as I walked. More stones appeared, always landing just out of reach, a constant reminder of the unseen presence in the woods. When I finally reached the end of the road, I turned and began the journey back to my house. The sounds from the woods ceased, but the feeling of being watched remained. I walked as quickly as I could without breaking into a run, afraid that any sudden movement might provoke whatever was out there. As I neared my house, the familiar sights of my neighborhood began to dispel the fear that had gripped me. The unsettling quiet gave way to the normal sounds of a rural afternoon. Distant lawnmowers, dogs barking, children playing. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and sank into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. I tried to rationalize what had happened, to find some logical explanation for the sounds and the stones. But deep down, I knew that I had experienced something beyond the ordinary, something that defied easy explanation. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself paying closer attention to the woods around our home. I listened for unusual sounds, watched for movement among the trees. Sometimes in the early morning or late evening, I thought I caught glimpses of something large moving through the forest, but it was always just at the edge of my vision, gone before I could focus on it. I began to research, spending hours online and in the local library, looking for any information about similar sightings in our area. To my surprise, I found quite a few. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but a few seemed credible, described by level-headed individuals who, like me, had no reason to fabricate such stories. One account in particular caught my attention. It was from a hiker who had been camping in the woods about 20 miles from where I had my encounter. He described waking up in the middle of the night to find his campsite surrounded by large bipedal creatures. They didn't approach him directly, but spent hours circling his tent, occasionally beating on trees and throwing stones. The similarity to my own experience was uncanny. It made me wonder just how many of these creatures might be out there, living in the vast stretches of wilderness that still existed in our area. As time passed, my fear began to give way to curiosity. I found myself wanting to know more about these beings. Were they some unknown species of primate? A relic population of early hominids that had somehow survived to the present day? Or were they something else entirely? something that our current scientific understanding couldn't explain. I began to take more walks in the woods, always during daylight hours and never straying too far from well-traveled paths. I carried a camera with me, hoping to capture evidence of the creature's existence, but they remained elusive, leaving behind only the occasional inexplicable footprint or broken branch. My wife worried about my growing obsession, concerned that I was spending too much time chasing shadows in the forest. She urged me to let it go, to accept that some things in this world simply couldn't be explained. Part of me knew she was right, but another part couldn't shake the memory of that creature on the road or the unseen presence in the woods. As the years went by, I never had another clear sighting like that first encounter on the road. But there were moments, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye, an unusually large shadow among the trees, the sensation of being watched while walking in the woods. That kept the memory alive. I've come to accept that I may never fully understand what I saw that winter morning, or what was out there in the woods that day. But the experience has changed me. It's opened my eyes to the possibility that our world is far stranger and more mysterious than we often allow ourselves to believe. Now, when I hear stories of unexplained encounters or creatures that shouldn't exist, I listen with an open mind. I know firsthand that sometimes reality can be far more fantastic than fiction, and I can't help but wonder how many others out there have had similar experiences, their stories dismissed or kept secret for fear of ridicule. As for my grandmother's Thunderbird, it continued to serve her faithfully for many years after that night on Rock Hill. But she never drove it after dark again, preferring to stay close to home once the sun began to set. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees and shadows played at the edge of the porch light, I would sometimes catch her staring out into the darkness, a look of wary anticipation in her eyes. I often wonder about the creatures we encountered. Are they still out there, moving silently through the forests, occasionally revealing themselves to unsuspecting travelers? Or were our experiences some kind of shared delusion, a product of overactive imaginations, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist? I don't have answers to these questions, and perhaps I never will. But I do know that those encounters change the way I see the world. They've taught me to keep an open mind, to question what I think I know, and to remember that there are still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the forest seems to hold its breath, I find myself drawn to the edge of the woods. I stand there listening to the night sounds and watching the play of shadows among the trees. And every once in a while, I catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the reach of my vision. Something large, something that doesn't quite fit with what I know of the natural world. In those moments, I'm reminded of the vastness of the unknown, of the possibility that there are things in this world that defy our understanding. And while part of me still feels that old fear, that instinctive urge to retreat to the safety of the known, another part of me, the part that was forever changed by those encounters, feels a thrill of excitement. Because in a world where such creatures can exist, where the impossible can become possible, anything can happen. And that, I've come to realize, is both terrifying and wonderfully exhilarating. As I stand there at the edge of the woods, I often think back to my grandmother's encounter all those years ago. I wonder what she would think of my own experiences, of my continued fascination with the unknown. I like to think she would understand, that she would recognize in me the same sense of wonder and curiosity that her own encounter had sparked. In the end, these experiences, hers and mine, have become part of our family's lore, stories passed down and discussed in hushed tones around the dinner table, or by the firelight on camping trips. They've shaped our perception of the world around us, reminding us that there's always more to discover, more to learn, more to question. And so, even now, years after that first sighting on the road, I find myself drawn back to the woods. Not out of fear, not out of a desperate need for proof, but out of a deep-seated curiosity about the world around us and the mysteries it still holds. Because sometimes in the quiet moments between the known and the unknown, we catch glimpses of something truly extraordinary. And those glimpses, however brief, have the power to change us forever. The forest had always been my sanctuary, a place where the worries of the world seemed to dissolve with each step along the winding trails. My loyal companion, a sturdy German shepherd named Rocky, was always by my side, his tail wagging with excitement as we embarked on our daily adventures. Our favorite trail was a well-worn path that snaked through towering pines and ancient oaks. We had walked it countless times, and I knew every bend, every fallen log, and every babbling brook along the way. The familiarity of the route was comforting, like visiting an old friend. On that particular day, the air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine needles. The sun filtered through the canopy above, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Rocky trotted ahead as usual, his nose to the ground, occasionally lifting his head to catch a scent on the breeze. As we rounded a bend in the trail, Rocky suddenly froze. His ears perked up, and his body tensed. Before I could call out to him, he darted off the path and into the underbrush. I quickened my pace, following the sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs. "Rocky!" I called out, a hint of worry creeping into my voice. It wasn't like him to run off without responding to my calls. Then I heard it, a high-pitched, frantic barking that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the playful bark I was accustomed to hearing when Rocky chased squirrels or found an interesting stick. This was different. This was fear. I broke into a run, pushing through the dense foliage, branches whipping at my face and arms. The barking grew louder, more urgent. As I burst into a small clearing, the sight before me stopped me in my tracks. There, in the middle of the clearing, stood a makeshift tent. It was a patchwork of tarps and plastic sheets, held together by a network of ropes tied to surrounding trees. A thin wisp of smoke curled from a crude chimney fashioned from what looked like an old metal bucket. But it wasn't the tent that hit me first. It was the smell. An overwhelming acrid stench of concentrated urine assaulted my nostrils, so strong it made my eyes water. Rocky stood at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised, alternating between barking at the tent and looking back at me with wide, frightened eyes. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" No response came from the tent. The only sounds were Rocky's low growls and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. As I drew closer, I could make out more details of the campsite. A clothesline was strung between two trees, holding a few tattered garments. A stack of firewood was neatly piled near the entrance of the tent. Empty food cans and water bottles were scattered around, some crushed and others partially buried in the dirt. It was clear that someone had been living here for some time. But who? And why here, so close to the trail yet hidden from view? A sense of unease crept over me. This was no casual campsite set up by hikers or weekend campers. This was someone's home, hidden away in the depths of the forest. I felt like an intruder, stumbling upon a secret that wasn't meant to be discovered. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Near the entrance of the tent, partially obscured by a fallen branch, was a small notebook. Its cover was weathered and stained, but I could make out what looked like a list of dates and times scrawled across it. My curiosity got the better of me, and I took a step closer, straining to read the writing. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling from inside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard throughout the forest. "Rocky," I whispered, gesturing frantically for him to come to my side. "Let's go home." Rocky didn't need to be told twice. He quickly retreated to my side, pressing against my leg as we made our way back to the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as we left the clearing behind. The rest of our hike passed in a blur. My mind raced with questions and theories about the mysterious campsite. Who could be living out there? Were they in trouble? Or were they hiding from something or someone? When I arrived at work the next day, I couldn't keep the story to myself. During our morning coffee break, I recounted my experience to my coworkers. Their reactions ranged from fascination to concern. "That's so creepy," said Karen, a fellow hiking enthusiast. "I've been on that trail dozens of times and never seen anything like that." "Maybe it's just some homeless person trying to find a quiet place to live," suggested Mike from accounting. "Times are tough for a lot of people these days." "Or it could be something more sinister," added Jennifer, always one for dramatic theories. "What if it's a fugitive hiding out in the woods?" Their speculations only fueled my curiosity. I decided I needed to go back and investigate further. Maybe in the light of day, with a clearer head, I could make more sense of what I'd seen. The next afternoon, I set out on the trail again, this time without Rocky. I wanted to approach the site quietly, without alerting anyone who might be there. As I neared the spot where we had veered off the path the day before, I slowed my pace and moved as silently as possible through the underbrush. But when I reached the clearing, I stopped short in disbelief. The campsite was gone, completely vanished, as if it had never existed. There was no tent, no clothesline, no stack of firewood. Even the garbage was gone. I stood there, dumbfounded, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. Had I imagined the whole thing? No, that was impossible. The memory of the urine smell alone was too vivid to be a figment of my imagination. I scoured the area, looking for any sign that might confirm what I'd seen the day before. A scrap of tarp, a forgotten can, even a trampled patch of grass. But there was nothing. The forest floor was undisturbed, covered in a thick layer of leaves and pine needles that showed no sign of recent activity. Most puzzling of all was the absence of the urine smell. Such a strong odor shouldn't have dissipated so quickly, especially since there had been no rain. It was as if someone had scrubbed the entire area clean, erasing every trace of human presence. As I stood there trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of trees and undergrowth. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct sensation of being watched. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of a human presence. But the forest remained still and silent. I hurried back to the main trail, constantly looking over my shoulder. The peaceful serenity I usually felt in these woods was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that seemed to seep from the very trees themselves. I returned home that evening more confused than ever. The mystery of the vanishing campsite consumed my thoughts. I found myself lying awake at night, replaying the events in my mind, trying to find some explanation that made sense. The mystery of the vanishing campsite continued to haunt me long after that day. I found myself returning to the spot time and time again, always hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what I had seen. But the forest kept its secrets well. One crisp autumn morning, about a year after the incident, Rocky and I set out on our usual trail. The leaves had begun to turn, painting the forest in vibrant shades of red, orange, and gold. As we approached the area where we had found the campsite, Rocky's behavior changed. His ears pricked up and he began to whine softly. I felt a familiar sense of unease wash over me. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, scanning the area. That's when I saw it, a flash of color among the fallen leaves. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. There, half buried in the dirt, was a small notebook. Its cover was weathered and stained, but I recognized it instantly as the one I had glimpsed near the tent all those months ago. With trembling hands, I picked it up and opened it. Inside, I found a series of cryptic entries. Dates, times, and what looked like coordinates filled the pages. Some entries were accompanied by strange symbols I didn't recognize. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes neat and precise, other times wild and barely legible. As I flipped through the pages, a small photograph fell out. It showed a man standing in front of a cabin I didn't recognize. His face was partially obscured, but there was something familiar about his stance, the set of his shoulders. I tucked the notebook and photo into my pocket, my mind reeling. What did it all mean? Who was the man in the photo? And how had this notebook suddenly appeared after all this time? On the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves seemed to hold a hidden menace. Rocky sensed my unease, staying close to my side and occasionally looking back the way we had come. That night I pored over the notebook, trying to make sense of its contents. The coordinates seemed to point to various locations within the forest, some close to the trails, others deep in areas rarely visited by hikers. The symbols remained a mystery, but they appeared more frequently in the later entries, often accompanied by frantic scribbles that I couldn't decipher. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn back to the forest, this time with a purpose. Using the coordinates from the notebook, I began to explore areas of the woods I had never visited before. Each location held its own mystery, an oddly arranged pile of stones, a tree with strange markings carved into its trunk, a clearing where nothing seemed to grow. But it was at the last set of coordinates that I made the most startling discovery. Deep in the heart of the forest, far from any trail, I found the remains of an old cabin. It was the same one from the photograph, though now it was little more than a collapsed ruin reclaimed by nature. As I stood there staring at the decaying structure, I felt a shift in the air. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And then, carried on the wind, I heard what sounded like distant whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent shivers down my spine. Rocky growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on something in the trees behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches. It was then that I realized the true nature of my discovery. The campsite, the notebook, this cabin, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one that the forest itself seemed determined to keep hidden. I had stumbled upon something old, something secret, and perhaps something dangerous. As Rocky and I made our way home that day, I knew that my relationship with the forest had changed forever. It was no longer just a place of peace and refuge. It had become a keeper of secrets, a guardian of mysteries that stretched back through time. I never saw the campsite again, nor did I encounter any other unexplained phenomena in the woods. But I never forgot the lessons I learned during that strange period of my life. The world is full of mysteries, some of which are not meant to be solved. Sometimes the greatest adventure lies not in finding answers, but in embracing the questions themselves. To this day, Rocky and I still walk those forest trails. And while the immediate fear and excitement of that time have faded, a sense of wonder remains. For now I know that beyond every bend in the path, behind every ancient tree, there might be a story waiting to be discovered. If only we have the courage to look. The notebook remains in my possession, a constant reminder of the thin veil that separates the world we know from the one we don't. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself opening it once again, tracing my fingers over its cryptic contents, and wondering about the secrets that still lie hidden in the heart of the forest. As I sit here, pen in hand, the memories of my youth flood back like a torrent of dark water. The events I'm about to recount took place over 2 decades ago, but they remain as vivid and terrifying as if they happened yesterday. My name is Daniel Hawthorne, and this is the story of the summer that changed everything. It was the sweltering August of 2003 when my parents shipped me off to my Uncle Jeb's farm in the backwoods of Montana. At 17, I was a city kid through and through, more accustomed to dodging traffic than avoiding cowpats. But my folks thought some fresh air and hard work would do me good. If only they knew what awaited me at Evernight Farm. The place was aptly named. Situated at the end of a winding dirt road that seemed to stretch on forever, Uncle Jeb's property was an island of cleared land in a sea of dense, dark forest. The trees loomed ominously, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, as if trying to reclaim the farm for the wilderness. My cousin Tommy was 13 at the time, a scrawny, freckle-faced kid with a mop of unruly red hair and an infectious grin. He was thrilled to have company, eagerly showing me around the dilapidated farmhouse and introducing me to the menagerie of animals that called Evernight home. "You're going to love it here, Danny," Tommy exclaimed, his enthusiasm barely contained. "There's so much to explore." I nodded, trying to muster some excitement, but the isolation of the place was already starting to weigh on me. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sounds were the occasional moo of a cow or the rustle of wind through the cornfields. Uncle Jeb was a taciturn man, weathered and leathery from years of working the land. His wife, Aunt Mabel, had passed away years ago, leaving him to raise Tommy alone. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a gruff, "Welcome to Evernight," before returning to his never-ending list of chores. The first few days passed in a blur of farm work and exploration. Tommy and I spent our free time roaming the woods that bordered the property, pushing deeper and deeper into the forest with each excursion. It was during these wanderings that I first noticed something off about the place. The deeper we ventured, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on us like a physical weight. The usual forest sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, scurrying critters, faded away, replaced by an eerie silence that set my teeth on edge. "Tommy," I asked one afternoon as we paused to catch our breath, "have you ever noticed how quiet it gets out here?" He shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow. "I guess. Uncle Jeb says it's 'cause of the old mines, says they go deep, and sometimes the earth just swallows up sound." I frowned, unconvinced. There was something more to it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. It wasn't until a week into my stay that things took a turn for the truly bizarre. Tommy and I had lost track of time during one of our woodland expeditions, and the sun was already dipping below the horizon when we realized how late it had gotten. "Shit," I muttered, checking my watch. "We need to head back now." Tommy's eyes widened with fear. "Oh no, Uncle Jeb's gonna be so mad. He always says we gotta be home before dark." We set off at a brisk pace, but the fading light made navigation difficult. The shadows lengthened, stretching across our path like grasping hands. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What was that?" Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, a twig snapped loudly to our left. We both whirled around, and that's when I saw it. A face peering out from behind a gnarled oak tree. But it wasn't a human face, nor any animal I recognized. Its skin was a sickly gray-green, rough and mottled like weathered stone. But it was the eyes that froze me in place, glowing orbs of deep crimson that seemed to bore right through me. "Run!" I shouted, giving Tommy a push to get him moving. We took off, crashing through the underbrush as fast as our legs could carry us. The creature, whatever it was, let out an unearthly shriek that sent ice through my veins. And it wasn't alone. All around us the forest came alive with movement and sound. More shrieks, the beating of leathery wings, the scrape of claws against bark. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing pursuing us was like something out of a nightmare, vaguely humanoid in shape, but with elongated limbs ending in razor-sharp talons. Its wings, bat-like and enormous, allowed it to swoop between trees with terrifying agility. "Don't look back!" I yelled to Tommy, who was starting to falter. "Just keep running!" The edge of the woods seemed impossibly far away, but finally, mercifully, we burst out onto the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. I could see Uncle Jeb on the porch, shotgun in hand, his face a mask of grim determination. We staggered up the steps, gasping for air. Uncle Jeb didn't say a word, just nodded towards the door. We tumbled inside, and I heard the distinct sound of a shotgun being racked. "You boys stay put," Uncle Jeb growled. "I'll handle this." For the next hour, we huddled in the living room, jumping at every sound. But there were no gunshots, no more unearthly shrieks. When Uncle Jeb finally came back inside, his expression was unreadable. What were those things?" I managed to ask between gulps of air. Uncle Jeb sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 60-odd years. "Gargoyles," he said simply, "or that's what my PA always called 'em. Been here longer than we have, I reckon." "But that's impossible," I protested. "Gargoyles are just statues, they're not real." Uncle Jeb fixed me with a hard stare. "There's a lot of things in this world that ain't supposed to be real, boy. Doesn't mean they aren't." That night marked the beginning of a summer unlike any other. The gargoyles, it seemed, had taken an interest in us. They never ventured onto the farm proper. Uncle Jeb's shotgun saw to that, but we could feel their presence, always watching from the tree line. Some nights we'd hear them circling the house, their wings creating a sound like leather snapping in the wind. Other times, we'd wake to find strange symbols carved into the barn door or arcane patterns laid out in the cornfields. Uncle Jeb took it all in stride, as if dealing with stone monsters was just another part of farm life. He taught us how to ward them off. Iron nails driven into door frames, circles of salt around the house, certain herbs burned at twilight. It was a crash course in an arcane world I never knew existed. As the weeks wore on, I found myself torn between terror and fascination. Part of me wanted nothing more than to flee back to the safety of the city. But another part, a part I didn't quite understand, was drawn to the mystery of it all. One particularly memorable night, I awoke to the sound of something heavy landing on the roof. The whole house seemed to groan under the weight. I crept to the window, heart pounding, and peered out into the moonlit yard. There, perched on the edge of the roof like some twisted gargoyle from a Gothic cathedral, was one of the creatures. It was larger than the others we'd seen, its wings spread wide, casting a monstrous shadow across the ground. And it was looking right at me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. I could feel its alien intelligence probing at the edges of my mind, seeking something. Then, with a powerful beat of its wings, it was gone, leaving me shaken to my core. The next morning I found a strange object on my windowsill, a small, intricately carved stone that seemed to pulse with an inner light. When I showed it to Uncle Jeb, his face paled. "That's a seeker stone," he said gravely. "They've marked you, boy. From now on, no matter where you go, they'll be able to find you." The implications of his words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a summer adventure anymore. This was something that would follow me for the rest of my life. As August drew to a close and my time at Evernight Farm came to an end, I found myself changed in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The world seemed bigger, darker, full of secrets and shadows I'd never noticed before. On my last night, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set over the cornfields, Uncle Jeb cleared his throat. "You've seen things this summer most folks go their whole lives without knowing exist," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "It's a burden, sure, but it's also a gift. You've been given a glimpse behind the curtain, Danny. What you do with that knowledge is up to you." I nodded, clutching the seeker stone in my pocket. Will they come for me back in the city?" Uncle Jeb shook his head. "Not likely. They're bound to this land for the most part, but they'll remember you, and you'll remember them. And sometimes that's enough to change a person's whole life." He was right, of course. In the years that followed, I found myself drawn to the hidden corners of the world, seeking out the stories and creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of normal perception. I've seen things that would turn most people's hair white, faced dangers that defy explanation. But through it all, I've never forgotten that summer at Evernight Farm, where I first learned that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we could ever imagine. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can still hear the beat of leathery wings and the low, rumbling growl of creatures that should not exist. The gargoyles of Evernight may be bound to their forest, but a part of me will always be bound to them, a reminder that there are shadows in this world, and sometimes the shadows have teeth. The events I'm about to recount still send shivers down my spine, even years later. It was late January, shortly after the New Year celebrations had faded, when I embarked on what I thought would be a routine hunting trip. Little did I know that it would become the most terrifying experience of my life. I had been feeling restless, cooped up in my small apartment in Duluth, Minnesota. The winter had been harsh, with record-breaking snowfall and temperatures that made even the hardiest Minnesotans think twice about venturing outdoors. But I've always been one to push boundaries, and the call of the wilderness was too strong to ignore. I reached out to my old friend, whom I'll call Alex for the sake of this story. Alex and I had been hunting buddies since high school, but life had gotten in the way recently, and we hadn't seen much of each other. When I called him up, I could hear the strain in his voice. He confided that he and his longtime girlfriend, Melissa, had been going through a rough patch. They'd been arguing constantly, and he felt suffocated. "A hunting trip sounds perfect," Alex said, his voice brightening for the first time in our conversation. "I need to clear my head, get away from all this drama for a while." We made plans for him to pick me up the next morning. I spent the evening packing, carefully considering what to bring. My trusty .30-06 rifle was in the shop for repairs, so I decided to take my muzzle loader instead. It wasn't my first choice, but it would do the job. Little did I know how much I would come to regret that decision. The next morning dawned cold and gray. Alex pulled up in his battered Ford pickup, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually neatly trimmed beard had grown wild and unkempt. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I couldn't help but worry about my friend's state of mind. "You sure you're up for this, Alex?" I asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. He nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, man, I need this. Thanks for inviting me." We set off, leaving the city behind and heading north into the vast wilderness of northern Minnesota. Our destination was a remote cabin I owned near Ely, deep in the Superior National Forest. It was a 3-hour drive, and as we traveled, the landscape grew increasingly wild and untamed. Alex and I fell into easy conversation, reminiscing about past hunting trips and catching up on each other's lives. He opened up more about his troubles with Melissa, how they'd grown apart over the years, and how he feared their relationship might be beyond saving. I listened, offering what advice I could, but mostly just lending an ear. As we neared our destination, the forest grew thicker, the trees pressing close to the road. Snow-laden branches formed a canopy overhead, creating a tunnel-like effect that was both beautiful and slightly claustrophobic. The sun was beginning to set as we finally turned onto the rutted dirt road that led to my cabin. "Home sweet home," I said as we pulled up to the small, rustic structure. It was a simple one-room affair, built by my grandfather decades ago. It had no electricity or running water, but it was sturdy and had always served as a perfect base for hunting expeditions. We unloaded our gear and got the cabin set up for our stay. I fired up the old wood stove while Alex unpacked our supplies. As night fell, we sat by the warmth of the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey and talking in low voices about our plans for the hunt. "There's a clearing about 2 miles north of here," I explained, pointing to a spot on an old topographical map spread out between us. "I've had good luck there in the past. Lots of deer activity." Alex nodded, studying the map intently. "Sounds good. We'll head out at first light," I agreed, and we turned in early, both of us exhausted from the drive and the anticipation of the hunt to come. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The cabin creaked and groaned in the wind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with half-formed thoughts and vague anxieties. At one point, I could have sworn I heard something moving outside, circling the cabin, but when I peered out the frost-covered window, I saw nothing but darkness and swirling snow. Just as I was finally drifting off, a sound jolted me fully awake. It was a scream, or at least, that's what my sleep-addled brain first interpreted it as. But as I sat up, heart pounding, I realized it was more like a howl. Not quite a wolf, not quite an elk bugle, but something in between. Something I'd never heard before. I looked over at Alex, but he was still sound asleep, snoring softly. Had I imagined it? I lay back down, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe a fox, but deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. Morning came too soon, the pale winter sun barely peeking over the horizon as we set out. We were both bleary-eyed and quiet, conserving our energy for the hike ahead. The forest was eerily still, the only sound the crunch of our boots in the fresh snow. As we neared the clearing I'd mentioned, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The woods seemed wrong somehow. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. We set up our blind at the edge of the clearing, carefully arranging branches and brush to conceal ourselves. Then we settled in to wait, our breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Hours passed with no sign of game. Not even a squirrel crossed our path. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional whisper between Alex and me as we speculated on the strange lack of activity. It was nearing midday when we first caught a whiff of it, a stomach-turning stench that made my eyes water. It was like rotting meat mixed with something chemical, almost industrial. "What the hell is that?" Alex whispered, his face twisted in disgust. I shook my head, unable to place the odor. Maybe a dead animal nearby? Or a skunk? But even as I said it, I knew it was something else entirely. The smell grew stronger, and with it came a sense of dread that settled over me like a heavy blanket. That's when we saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It looked like a deer, but wrong. It stumbled into the clearing on spindly legs that seemed too long for its body. Its hide was patchy, hanging loose in some places and stretched tight over protruding bones in others. One of its antlers was snapped off at the base, the other twisted and deformed. But it was the creature's eyes that truly chilled me to the core. They glowed an unnatural yellow, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that no deer should possess. "Jesus Christ," Alex breathed beside me. "What is that thing?" I shook my head, unable to speak. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this abomination as possible. But I was frozen in place, unable to look away. The creature's head snapped towards our blind, those terrible eyes seeming to bore right through our camouflage. It took a halting step in our direction, then another. "We should shoot it," Alex whispered urgently. "Put it out of its misery." I nodded, raising my muzzle loader with shaking hands. But before I could take aim, Alex had already fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the silence of the forest. For a moment, everything was obscured by a cloud of gun smoke. When it cleared, the creature was gone. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, we emerged from the blind to investigate. There, where the creature had stood, was a large pool of blood staining the snow. But it wasn't the rich red of normal blood. It was a sickly greenish-black color that seemed to steam slightly in the cold air. "We should follow the trail," Alex said, his voice tight with tension. "Make sure it's dead." Every fiber of my being rebelled against the idea, but I nodded. We had a responsibility as hunters to ensure a clean kill, to not let an animal suffer needlessly, even if that animal was whatever this thing was. We followed the trail of bizarre blood through the forest. It led us on a twisting path, sometimes disappearing altogether only to reappear yards away. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. After what felt like miles, the trail suddenly ended at the base of a massive old pine tree. We searched the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of the creature. "This doesn't make any sense," Alex muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Where could it have gone?" That's when we noticed the claw marks. They ran up the trunk of the tree, deep gouges in the bark that no deer could have made. They extended far up into the branches, farther than we could see. A twig snapped somewhere behind us, and we both whirled around, weapons at the ready. But there was nothing there, just endless trees and shadows. "We should go back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't right." Alex nodded, his face pale. We turned to head back to the clearing, but nothing looked familiar. The forest had changed somehow, the trees seeming to shift and move when we weren't looking directly at them. Panic began to set in as we realized we were lost. We stumbled through the woods, no longer caring about stealth, just desperate to find our way back to the cabin. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, the forest came alive with sounds. Rustling in the underbrush, the crack of branches overhead, and always the feeling of being watched. Night had fully fallen by the time we finally stumbled out of the woods and saw the welcome sight of the cabin. But our relief was short-lived. The cabin door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. As we approached, we could see that the interior had been destroyed. Our supplies were scattered everywhere, sleeping bags torn to shreds, the wood stove overturned. "What the hell happened here?" Alex breathed, his eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, unable to process what I was seeing. That's when I heard it. The same unearthly howl I'd heard the night before, but closer now. Much closer. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. There at the edge of the clearing stood a figure. It was vaguely humanoid, but impossibly tall, at least 8 feet. Its skin was a sickly pale color, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Atop its head were antlers, the same broken, twisted antlers we'd seen on the deer-like creature earlier. For a moment, everything was still. Then the creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, and let out that bone-chilling scream again. We ran. We didn't bother with our gear, didn't stop to think. We just ran, scrambling into Alex's truck and peeling out of there as fast as we could. The entire drive back to Duluth, we kept expecting to see that pale, antlered figure in the rearview mirror. But there was nothing, just endless dark forest. We didn't speak much on the drive home, both of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. It wasn't until days later, after we'd had time to process everything, that we started researching. What we found chilled us to the bone. Stories of a creature called the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit of the northern forests, a being of insatiable hunger, capable of possessing humans and animals alike. The descriptions matched what we'd seen all too well. I've never returned to that cabin, and Alex and I don't talk much anymore. Some experiences are too profound, too terrifying to share. But I know that neither of us will ever forget what we saw that day in the woods. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I can't help but wonder if it's really just the wind I'm hearing, or something else, something hungry and patient, and very, very real.